There was a moment in your connection that felt different, but you couldn't quite explain why. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface, no clear ending, no obvious conflict, no final words that made it all make sense. And yet something shifted, the energy changed. The warmth you once felt started turning into distance. The closeness that once came so naturally began to feel uncertain. You started replaying conversations in your mind, wondering if you said too much or not enough, wondering if you gave too much or somehow pushed them away without realizing it. But what if none of that is the real reason? What if the truth is something deeper, something you were never meant to see? Because what you didn't know is that at some point you were placed into a hidden test, not a test you agreed to, not a test they consciously planned, but a test that quietly began the moment your presence started to matter more than they were ready to handle. And from that moment on, everything they did, every step back, every pause, every silence, wasn't random. It was part of something internal, something they themselves didn't fully understand. And the hardest part is this: while you were trying to hold the connection together, they were watching it unfold from a distance, measuring something you couldn't even see. This hidden test doesn't look like a test at all. It doesn't come with rules or explanations. There's no moment where they sit you down and say, "This is what I need to see." Instead, it begins quietly, almost invisibly, triggered by something emotional that feels too intense for them to process directly. It could be the way you showed consistency when others didn't. It could be how deeply you understood them without them having to explain. Or maybe it was simply the fact that with you, things started to feel real, and real is exactly what they struggle with the most. Because when emotions start to deepen, when connection begins to feel meaningful instead of casual, something inside them activates. Not love in the way you experience it, but defense, protection, distance. And this is where the test begins. They start pulling back, not necessarily because they've stopped caring, but because caring feels like a loss of control. And without telling you, they begin observing. They watch how you respond to their distance. They notice whether you chase them, question them, or try to fix what's happening. They pay attention to your energy, your reactions, your silence. And the truth is, you were never just experiencing a shift in behavior. You were being unknowingly evaluated in a moment that was never meant to be fair. And out of all the people they could have distanced from, all the connections they could have slowly faded away from, somehow you became the one they tested. That wasn't an accident. It wasn't random timing or coincidence. There was something about you that made it different, something about your presence that didn't allow them to stay emotionally neutral. You made them feel seen in a way they weren't used to. You made them feel understood without needing to perform. And most importantly, you made them feel something they couldn't easily escape from. And that's exactly what made you the test. Because for someone who is used to keeping emotions at a safe distance, feeling something real doesn't feel comforting. It feels threatening. It feels like losing control over their own space, their own independence, their own identity. So instead of leaning into it, instead of embracing what's building between you, they step back and create distance, not because you lacked value, but because you had too much of it. And now, without realizing it, you were placed in a position where your actions would determine how they interpret that feeling, whether they see it as safe or something they need to escape from. At the core of all of this is a fear that rarely gets spoken about openly. It's not just fear of commitment in the way people casually describe it. It's deeper than that. It's the fear of being emotionally overwhelmed, the fear of being needed too much, the fear that if they let themselves fully feel what's building, they might lose the sense of control they've worked so hard to maintain. And when that fear gets triggered, it doesn't show up as vulnerability. It shows up as distance. It shows up as confusion, mixed signals, delayed responses, and emotional withdrawal. From your side, it feels like something is breaking. It feels like you're losing them without understanding why. But from their side, it feels like they're trying to protect themselves from something they don't know how to manage. And this is where the hidden test becomes more intense, because now they're not just observing casually, they're watching closely. They're trying to see if your presence adds pressure or creates space, if your love feels overwhelming or freeing. And the painful truth is, no matter how genuine your intentions were, the way they interpret your actions is filtered through that fear. So even your care, your effort, your willingness to stay, can sometimes be seen as something they need to pull away from. And then it happens, the moment you felt the most, the moment they started pulling away in a way that you couldn't ignore anymore. Maybe it was slower replies, maybe conversations became shorter, less meaningful, maybe the energy shifted from warmth to distance so subtly that at first you questioned yourself instead of them. You tried to adjust, you tried to give them space, but not too much. You tried to show care without overwhelming them. You tried to hold on to the connection without appearing like you were chasing it. But no matter what you did, something felt off. And what you didn't realize is that this phase, this exact moment of confusion, was part of the test reaching its peak. Because as they pulled away, they were paying attention to one thing more than anything else: how you responded to the distance. Did you hold your ground, or did you move closer? Did you trust yourself, or did you start seeking reassurance from them? Did you remain centered, or did their withdrawal pull you into uncertainty? And this is what makes it so emotionally intense, because while you were trying to save the connection, they were trying to understand it from a distance. They were measuring something unspoken, something invisible. And in that silence, in that space where communication faded and clarity disappeared, the test was unfolding in ways you never agreed to, but were deeply affected by. And then came the silence. Not just the absence of words, but the kind of silence that makes you question everything, the kind that lingers in your chest long after the conversation ends or doesn't even begin. It wasn't just that they stopped saying as much, it was that you could feel them slowly disappearing without ever fully leaving. And that's what made it so confusing, because if someone walks away clearly, you can process it, you can grieve it, you can begin to move on. But this felt unfinished, like something was still there, just out of reach. And what you didn't realize is that this silence wasn't empty, it was active, it was intentional on a level they might not even consciously admit. Because in that silence they were watching, not in a manipulative way, but in a self-protective one. They were trying to see what your next move would be without having to risk anything themselves. Would you break the silence first? Would you reach out, double text, ask what's wrong? Or would you hold back and allow the space to exist without trying to control it? And as painful as it sounds, that silence became one of the most important parts of the test. Because for them, silence creates safety. It gives them room to breathe, room to think, room to feel without pressure. But for you, it created uncertainty, doubt, and emotional tension. And in that contrast, something deeper was being revealed, not just about them, but about you too. Because in that space, whether you realized it or not, your reaction became your answer. Not the words you said, not the explanations you tried to give, but the energy you carried when things stopped being clear. If you leaned forward, trying to close the gap, trying to bring things back to how they were, it signaled something to them. That connection equals pressure. That closeness leads to expectation, and even though your intentions came from a genuine place, from a desire to understand and reconnect, it translated differently on their side. It confirmed the very fear they were trying to avoid. But if something else happened, if at some point you paused, took a step back, and allowed the silence to exist without chasing it, that created a completely different effect. It didn't mean you stopped caring. It didn't mean you gave up. It meant you stayed grounded within yourself even when the connection felt uncertain. And that's what they were unknowingly looking for. Not perfection, not detachment in a cold way, but emotional steadiness. The ability to not collapse into the distance even when it felt uncomfortable. And the truth is, most people don't even realize they're being placed in this position. They just react based on how much they feel. But in this case, how you reacted carried more weight than you could see at the time. There's something that happens inside them when distance is met with more distance, not as rejection, but as calm. It disrupts their expectations because they're used to one pattern. They're used to people leaning in harder when they pull away. They're used to being chased, questioned, or emotionally pursued. And when that doesn't happen, when instead they feel space, something shifts internally. It doesn't immediately make them come closer, but it creates curiosity. It creates a sense of emotional safety they didn't expect, because suddenly the connection doesn't feel like something that's trying to take from them. It feels like something that exists without pressure. And that's rare for them, that's unfamiliar. And unfamiliar in this case doesn't feel threatening. It feels intriguing, because now, instead of focusing on how to protect themselves from you, they begin to wonder about you. They begin to notice your absence in a different way, not as relief, but as something that holds weight, something that isn't easily replaced or ignored. And this is where the dynamic begins to shift beneath the surface, quietly, subtly, without any direct conversation. Because while you may have felt like nothing was happening, something was. But even as that shift begins, it doesn't mean everything suddenly becomes clear for them. In fact, this is where their internal conflict becomes the strongest, because now they're caught between two opposing forces. On one side, there's the part of them that felt something real with you, the part that recognizes your value, your presence, the way you made them feel without trying too hard. And on the other side, there's the part of them that fears what that connection could demand from them, the part that wants to maintain distance, independence, and emotional control at all costs. And these two sides don't peacefully coexist. They clash, they create hesitation, they create inconsistency. One moment they might feel the pull toward you, the next moment they retreat back into themselves. And from your perspective, it feels like mixed signals, like confusion, like something that doesn't make sense. But from their perspective, it's a battle they don't fully understand how to resolve. Because choosing you means facing emotions they're not used to handling, and choosing distance means potentially losing something that felt different. And so they stay in between, not fully leaving, not fully returning, just existing in a space where the test continues, even when neither of you realize it's still happening. And then comes a moment, one that doesn't announce itself, one that doesn't come with a clear sign, but it changes everything. It's the moment you start to shift, not because you planned it perfectly, not because you figured everything out, but because something inside you begins to settle. Maybe you get tired of overthinking. Maybe you realize that no amount of effort can force clarity from someone who isn't ready to give it. Or maybe, slowly, you begin to choose yourself in ways you hadn't before. You stop analyzing every delay. You stop trying to decode every silence. You start pulling your energy back, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And that's when something powerful happens. Because while you're focusing less on them, they begin noticing more about you, the energy they once felt from you, the attention, the presence, the availability. It's no longer the same, and that absence doesn't go unnoticed. It creates a shift in perception, because now, instead of feeling like they have control over the distance, they begin to feel the distance itself, and that's something they didn't prepare for. This is the part no one talks about enough. The moment they begin to feel your absence not as silence but as impact, because when you were there consistently, when your energy was present and available, it became something they could rely on without fully acknowledging. It was there, steady, predictable, almost like background noise they didn't have to question. But when that changes, when you're no longer showing up in the same way, when your energy becomes quieter, more reserved, more centered within itself, it creates space for something they had been avoiding, feeling, not just surface-level awareness but deeper emotional recognition. They start to notice the difference in their day, in their thoughts, in the small moments where your presence used to exist. And at first they might try to ignore it. They might distract themselves, convince themselves it doesn't mean anything. But the truth has a way of surfacing in silence. And now, the same space they once used to observe you becomes the space where they begin to feel you. And this is where everything inside them becomes louder than they expected. Because now, it's no longer just about observing you or maintaining distance, it's about facing what that distance actually means. There's a voice in them that tells them to stay where they are, to keep things controlled, to not risk stepping back into something that once made them feel exposed. That voice feels safe, familiar. It reminds them of who they've always been. Someone who doesn't rely too much on anyone, someone who doesn't lose themselves in emotions. But then there's another voice, quieter but persistent, the one that replays your presence in their mind, the one that reminds them how natural things felt with you before they pulled away, the one that starts asking questions they can't easily silence. What if that connection was different? What if walking away wasn't strength but avoidance? And now they're caught between these two forces, one rooted in protection, the other rooted in truth. And the more time passes, the harder it becomes to ignore that second voice. Because it doesn't come from fear, it comes from something real, something they didn't fully allow themselves to feel when you were right in front of them. And now, in your absence, it becomes impossible to completely shut it down. But even with all of this building inside them, there's still something that holds them back, something that keeps them from reaching out, even when they think about it more than they'd ever admit. It's not that they don't want to, it's that they don't trust what will happen if they do, because reaching out means stepping back into a space where they might feel that intensity again. It means risking the same emotions they once pulled away from. And more than anything, it means losing the sense of control they regained when they created distance. So instead they hesitate. They sit with the feeling instead of acting on it. They tell themselves it's better this way, that silence is easier than uncertainty. And from your side, it can feel like indifference, like they've moved on without a second thought. But the truth is far more complicated than that, because silence doesn't always mean absence of feeling. Sometimes it means the feeling is too strong to act on, too unfamiliar to trust, and so they remain where they are. Not because you didn't matter, but because what you meant to them became something they didn't know how to handle. And then comes a realization, one that doesn't happen all at once, but builds slowly over time. It's not triggered by a single thought, but by a pattern they begin to notice. The way things feel different without you, the way other interactions don't carry the same depth, the way your absence doesn't fade as quickly as they expected it to, and eventually it leads them to something they can't ignore anymore. You weren't just another connection. You weren't just someone who happened to be there at the right time. There was something about you that stood out, something that didn't fit into their usual patterns, and more importantly, something they haven't been able to replace. And this realization shifts their perspective, because now it's no longer about avoiding pressure, it's about understanding what they may have walked away from. And that awareness can be uncomfortable, because it forces them to confront the possibility that the distance they created wasn't necessary, that the fear they acted on may have cost them something meaningful. And once that thought takes root, it doesn't easily go away. This is the moment where everything begins to turn inward for them, where the question is no longer about what you did or didn't do, but about what they might lose. Because up until now, the distance gave them a sense of control. It allowed them to feel like they were protecting themselves, like they were maintaining stability. But now, that same distance starts to feel different. It starts to feel like separation, like something slipping further away the longer they stay still. And that's when a new kind of fear begins to take over. Not the fear of closeness, but the fear of loss. The fear that you might not be there in the same way if they return. The fear that your energy has shifted permanently. The fear that the version of you that once gave so freely is no longer available. And this fear hits differently, because it's no longer about protecting themselves from you. It's about realizing they may not have access to you anymore. And that realization can shake even the most emotionally distant person, because it forces them to see something they avoided before: your value. Not just when you were present, but now that you're not. And without you even realizing it, something powerful has already happened. You changed the dynamic. Not by forcing anything, not by trying to prove your worth, but by stepping back into yourself. By no longer overextending, no longer trying to control the outcome, no longer chasing clarity from someone who wasn't ready to give it. You created space, and in that space your presence became something they could finally feel without resistance. Your silence, your calm, your ability to hold yourself together even when things felt uncertain, it spoke louder than anything you could have said. It showed strength, not in the way most people think of it, but in a quiet, grounded way that doesn't seek validation. And that's what made it powerful. Because now, instead of being someone they felt they needed to manage or distance from, you became someone they couldn't easily understand, someone who didn't react the way they expected. And that difference, that shift in energy, is what made them pause. It's what made them reflect. It's what made them feel something they didn't plan to feel. And in that moment, without ever knowing it, you passed the test they never told you about. And this is where the story takes a turn that most people don't expect, because if they come back, it won't feel random. It won't be out of nowhere, even if it seems that way on the surface. By the time they reach out again, something inside them has already shifted. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to break the pattern they were stuck in before. Because now, the distance they once needed no longer feels as safe as it did. Now it carries weight. Now it reminds them of what they've been sitting with, your absence, your energy, the space you once filled so naturally. And when they return, it often comes quietly, a message that seems simple, a small attempt to reconnect, something that doesn't fully express everything they've been feeling, but carries the intention behind it. And this is where it becomes important to understand something clearly. Their return is not just about missing you, it's about them reaching a point where avoiding the connection became harder than facing it, where the silence no longer gave them peace, it gave them awareness, and that awareness led them back to you. But even in this moment, even when it feels like everything is coming full circle, the test doesn't disappear completely, because now it shifts into something deeper, something that depends not on what they do next, but on what you do. Because this is where most people lose everything they unknowingly built. When they finally come back, when the silence breaks and the connection reopens, it's natural to feel relief. It's natural to want things to go back to how they were, to feel that closeness again, to fill in the gaps, to give them the same energy you once gave so freely. But this is where the pattern can quietly reset itself if you're not aware, because if you immediately return to overgiving, over-explaining, or overextending, it brings back the same dynamic that made them pull away in the first place. And not because you're doing something wrong, but because the balance that was created during the distance begins to disappear. The emotional steadiness you found within yourself, the grounded energy that made them reflect, starts to shift back into effort. An effort, when it feels like pressure, can trigger the same response again. And this is the part no one prepares you for. Because it's not just about whether they come back, it's about whether you can hold on to the version of yourself that existed without them, the version of you that didn't need constant reassurance, the version of you that remained centered even in uncertainty, because that's the version of you that changed everything. And when you step back and look at everything that happened, you begin to realize something deeper. This was never truly about proving your worth to someone else. It was never about passing a test so that they could finally choose you. Because the truth is, you were always enough from the very beginning. What this experience did was reveal something to you that couldn't have been understood any other way. It showed you how you respond when something meaningful feels uncertain. It showed you where you lose yourself trying to hold on to someone. It showed you the difference between connection and control, between love and overextension, and most importantly, it showed you what happens when you stop chasing and start returning to yourself. Because the moment you did that, everything shifted, not just in them but in you. Your perspective changed, your energy changed, your understanding of your own value became clearer, stronger, more grounded. And that's the real lesson hidden beneath all of this. Not whether they come back or not, but whether you recognize what you gained in the process. And this is the final truth, the one that brings everything together, even if it's not the easiest to accept. Whether they return or not, whether the connection rebuilds or fades into something that simply taught you what you needed to learn, you didn't lose. Because at some point in all of this, you stopped trying to force something outside of you to give you clarity, and you found it within yourself instead. You stopped measuring your value based on someone else's ability to stay, and started recognizing it based on your ability to stand on your own. And that changes everything, because now you're no longer in a position where someone's distance defines your worth. You're no longer waiting for someone else to choose you so that you can feel chosen. You already are, and that's what makes this ending powerful, because it's not really an ending at all. It's a shift into a version of yourself that understands something deeper, That connection isn't about chasing, convincing, or proving. It's about alignment. It's about mutual presence. It's about two people meeting without fear controlling the outcome. And if they come back, you'll see it clearly. And if they don't, you'll still stand in that same clarity. Because in the end, the hidden test was never just about them. It was about you realizing that you were never meant to lose yourself trying to be chosen.